Hello everyone at the CG Scholar community. My name is Joao Rosmaninho and I'm Assistant Professor in Architecture at the University of Minho, Portugal. I will now start my presentation in the Global Studies Conference 2020. Thank you all. For this presentation, my aim is to suggest that some global and very close and real events we are now experiencing or living with have been already unveiled quite accurately by the science fiction genre. As a method, I use fiction through a corpus made out of 3 original sources to understand a bit of the complexity that persists in our collective existence. Assembling and putting together architectural elements, literature modes, and audiovisual approaches, we will try to scrutinize multiple understandings of our own and apparently adjacent present realism. Maybe, after having searched them located in a dystopian fictional future, we can recognize them in front of us. So, I have organized this presentation in 5 parts. Firstly, part 1 will establish the content. Then, part 2 will introduce the case studies. In third, we'll deepen those 3 sources identifying settings, timelines, characters, displays, and other phenomena. And next, part 4 will return to the realist realm, hoping to reiterate some of the already listed topics. In the end, part 5 will emphasize the reverberations between fiction and reality, looking at them as dependent and subordinate dimensions. Following Mark Fisher's theoretical work on contemporary society and literature, science fiction may enhance multiple understandings of a globalized reality. According to the thinker, the science fiction genre resonates a permanent link between present modes of governance and scopes of inequality. At some point, we can notice that current political systems, even those called democratic, tend to deal with migration, statelessness, unbalanced population and resources in a way quite common in some dystopias. And I quote, "Democracy is suspended for all that we know. The authoritarian measures that are everywhere in place could have been implemented within a political structure that remains notionally democratic." End of quote. Sociologist Saskia Sassen, in the conclusion of her The Global City volume, a major work on urban economy, puts the hypothesis of existing a new urban regime. Pursuing this intention, Sassen uses topics such as mobility, patterns, hierarchies, spatial organizations and polarizations, inequalities, etc., in order to achieve a clearer model of defining a city. In fact, in The Possibility of Hope film, Alfonso Cuarón's 2007 documentary on his Children of Men version, Sassen considers that, quote, "the good scenario is that the countries where the people are coming from, together with the countries where they are going to, get their act together, creating the economic environment so that people don't have to leave if they don't want to. Now, the problem is, these things, the environmental question, the economic question, the civil wars, the privatizing of land, they are all pushing off people." According to this issue, though, Martin Barry also stresses that, quote, "the question, where are you from, is the first level of social integration, so the first step of designing integration of a city." End of quote. In a world where the circulation and migration of people is getting harder and being cut, in a globe facing similar problems but with disjointed answers, one may diagnose the other as its fringe as the pole of every problem. For instance, it is easy to understand or even accept that urban territories are unbalanced. Don't get me wrong, but we seem to not have incorporated Le droit à la ville, Lefebvre's 1967 The Right to the City volume. Income and economic inequalities are shaping cities now, 50 years later. Although there are visible and invisible barriers, The first ones may be better drawn or exclusively refined, but the second ones are the silent and most impacting. In an 2007 essay called The Clash of Civilizations at the End of History, Slavoj Zizek have noticed that, quote, today's predominant mode of politics is a politics of fear, a defense against potential victimization or harassment, fear of immigrants, fear of crime, fear of godless sexual depravity, fear of excessive state itself with too high taxation, fear of ecological catastrophes. At this point, and having already introduced some topics, I will focus my attention on the significance of this phenomena, as described in 3 texts, along with their visual adaptations. In the end, I'll seek to address how certain literary and cinematic visions have depicted and have assembled parallel versions of the urban space representing non-democratic dimensions. Our primary sources are 3 narratives from the 70s, 80s, and 90s of the 20th century, maybe now considered revelatory. Either J.G. Ballard's short story or Margaret Atwood's and P.D. James' novels can definitely identify several architectural dimensions. In fact, they reveal unstable and insecure architectures that characterize part of our Hodian, human, and urban emergencies. And through these fictional realisms, we seek to address how specific elements, such as walls, fences, ruins, abandoned places, gated communities, became common after being displayed in literary visions. In biographical terms, all authors are quite aware about the importance of fear, or, at the least, about the meaning of restriction or constraint. They seem to be prescient, even about the actual pandemic plague. This communication also uses secondary sources, being them cinematographic and television adaptations. With the exception of the first The Handmaid's Tale version, premiered less than 5 years after the book launch, all the other variations took more than a decade to appear. For what matters, the fictional realism we analyze and assume starts on fiction ground. Regarding timelines and chronology, in each narrative we are always facing the near future. In Low-Flying Aircraft and in The Handmaid's Tale, though, we are never informed about the period in which the main narrative occurs. Instead, we are aware that some memoirs endure. On the other hand, in the Children of Men narrative, the events occur mainly in 2021. The movie substitutes this year for 2027, with some references to history in 1995, for instance. Considering this subject, in the 1986 Solveig Nordlund's documentary, J.G. Ballard, The Future Is Now, the British novelist recalls that, quote, the only form of fiction that seems to me to have the vocabulary of ideas to deal with the next 5 minutes is science fiction. And I wanted science fiction for the present day. The future is a better key to the present than the past. End of quote. Regarding locations, one may recognize their geographies in all 3 narratives. Low-Flying Aircraft and The Children of Men do present and describe their settings. In the first, we follow a couple and an aircraft pilot physician wandering in Empuria Brava and Girona, in Costa Brava region, Spain. In the second, we are told about Oxford, London, Southwold, Dorset, and the Isle of Man in England. Still, in The Handmaid's Tale story, we are now informed about specific city names. We are not informed about specific city names, but we surely may realize that the Republic of Gilead substitutes New England region in the United States of America. In fact, the unnamed city where June, the protagonist, now lives corresponds and alludes to Cambridge and Boston, Massachusetts. Among the ensembles that populate every narrative, there are similar protagonists and narrators, dealing somehow with the decrease of birth rate or with the end of mankind. The Handmaid's Tale and The Children of Men are both written in first-person mode. Protagonist June, also known as Offred, and Theodore Faron are young adults that either record testimonies in the form of letters or decided to fill in a diary, a logbook. They both want to surpass their own present, using their memory to be listened, to be learned, or to be read later. June became captive of an aristocratic autocratic family in a patriarchal society, and Theo, the historian, became lost in his present. Low-flying aircraft is written under a third-person mode and tracks Richard and Judith Forrester doing what is necessary to give birth a child. These narratives depict martial states with inner city borders and buffers in monitored areas. They show segregated communities, marginalized ghettos and enclaves. Ruins emerge, as well as abandoned and obsolete places represent our present condition. In the future, we seem to be living in a past world. Architecture collapsed, infrastructures fell to the ground, and the environment became the last of our concerns, whenever we cannot reproduce ourselves as species. Infertility, meaning a plague, some sort of pandemic background, is obviously just a symptom of global cooling and urban decay. Similar phenomena cut both actual architecture and science fiction literature with the very same impact. Education, meaning doctrine, and confinement per se are just different ways of practicing or enhancing the loss of freedom. And the decrease of the birth rate argument gets this religious and far-right insight.
They make such a mess of everything. They fill the air with chemicals and radiation and poison. So God whipped up a special plague. The plague of infertility. Welcome. Find a seat, please. As birth rates fell, they made things worse. Birth control pills. Morning after pills. Murdering babies. Just so they could have their orgies. that he has taken away his most precious gift to us.
And surely one can relate this phenomena to our present cityscape. Migrations, health and sanitary politics, corruption, militarized protocols, and so many more, they all are certainly correlated to precise urban space categories such as gated communities, exclusive tracts, segregated areas, hard manifestations.
Mr. Farrow, the Minister's perspective, this way. I'm afraid this is not considered.
You've got something on the teeth.
Nevertheless, as Saskia Sassen establishes, and I quote, migrations are made, they don't just happen, end of quote. Following this mode of thinking, one may assume that our current condition and urban dimensions were made. They didn't just happen. Surveillance and insecurity are now merged. Our new urban protocols, new normal, they say, are pushing people apart. Sarah Schindler, in her 2015 architectural exclusion essay, stresses that, and I quote, cities are being constructed in ways, including by erecting physical barriers, that made it very difficult for people from one side of town to access the other side of town. End of quote. Cities have become zoned places with concrete buffer areas. Somehow, J.G. Ballard had already envisioned that in an interview from the 80s. And I quote, urban war in the late 20th century is endemic to the human condition and human beings must accept this. They are deluding themselves by imagining that peace will ever come. End of quote. Cities have become ruins and abandoned places with segregated communities, ghettos, and so on. And maybe, only then, with our walls in decrepit nature, they become our urban and visual escapes. At the same time, we are now dealing with never-ending urban practices, facing public health protocols that affect and enhance our social fears and traumas. Confinement, social distance, obstacles, gates, walls, they all separate and isolate us. They are all architectural liminal assets that exist in between, prohibiting transition or personal approaches. They all create rights and practices, norms and behaviors, segregating, orienting or disorienting. They enable utopias, dystopias and heterotopias, in Michel Foucault's words. And what we have brought to this presentation was just 3 fictional portraits that have anticipated in fiction a lot about our today reality. Some month ago, this image would be called strange. It still is, nonetheless we understand it, we know what it expresses and represents under our actual disturbing area. Thus, according to Fisher's position, even though the formulation of a capitalist realism may be the best method to scrutinize our present state, we believe that a fictional realism is needed to complement it. Thank you so much for screening and listening.